The news.
7 p.m. is the time here at Radio Jordan, broadcasting from Amman.
News headlines.
In our news bulletin for this evening, Jordanian protesters take to the streets after Friday prayers against the U.S.'s decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. 3 Palestinians are killed in today's clashes with Israeli forces. And the Yemeni army makes advances against the possessions of Houthi rebels in the Shabwa province. Those were the headlines. Now the news in detail. I'm Rabi Al-Hamamsa. Good evening. Tens of thousands of Jordanians have flocked into the streets after Friday prayers across the country to protest the U.S. administration's recognition of Jerusalem as capital of Israel and the relocation its embassy there. The protesters described the U.S. decision as biased towards the Israeli occupation, saying the United States is no longer a neutral mediator and sponsor of peace in the Middle East region. The demonstrators shouted that Jerusalem is the eternal capital of Palestine, condemning the international community for stripping Palestinians of their rights to exert and establish their own state with Jerusalem its capital. They also praised the stances of the Jordan headed by His Majesty the King, the custodian of Islamic and Christian holy sites in Jerusalem, for objecting the unilateral actions taken to Judaize the holy city. The protesters said the U.S. president's decision was illegitimate and runs contrary to international law, calling on the whole world to pressure the U.S. administration to reverse its decision. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has said that his country is launching an initiative at the United Nations to annul a decision by the United States to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Erdogan was speaking 2 days after a Muslim leaders' meeting in Istanbul condemned U.S. President Donald Trump's decision, calling on the world to respond by recognizing East Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine. He told crowds gathered in the central Anatolian city of Konya via teleconference that Ankara will work for the annulment of this unjust decision firstly at the UN Security Council, adding that if a veto comes from there, then it will be taken to the General Assembly. Palestinian medical sources have said that 3 people were killed after being shot by Israeli forces during today's protests in the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip. In Gaza, a spokesman for the Ministry of Health said in a press statement that 2 youths were shot in the neighborhood of Shujai. Near occupied Jerusalem, Palestinian authorities said 1 person was killed east of the holy city in clashes with Israeli forces. Meanwhile, Israeli troops shot and wounded more than 90 Palestinians in Gaza and West Bank as protest over U.S. President Donald Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital entered a second week. The Yemeni army and allied fighters have driven Houthi rebels from a town that was one of the last possessions they held in the country's south. Military sources and local officials said the forces advanced into Bahian, about 300 kilometers southeast of the Houthi-held capital Sana'a, killing dozens of the militants in clashes. Bahian is important in Yemen's war because it's located on major road linking Shabwa province with Houthi-held Ma'rib province to the north. The army also seized other possessions in the area where the movement of heavy artillery had been difficult because of the difficult terrain. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has told the Security Council that it was time to immediately re-establish and strengthen communication channels with North Korea to reduce tension in the Korean Peninsula. At a summit in Bologna, the UN chief said those should include inter-Korean and military-to-military channels to reduce the risk of a misunderstanding escalating into conflict. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said there must be a sustained cease of North Korea's threatening behavior before talks. Earlier, U.S. President Donald Trump said Washington hoped to receive more help from Russian President Vladimir Putin in efforts to convince North Korea to abandon abandon its missile and nuclear weapons program. EU leaders have ruled that sufficient progress has been made in the first phase of Brexit talks, allowing negotiations to move on to discussions about Britain's future outside the bloc. This came after the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, tweeted that EU leaders agreed on some issues of the Brexit. The leaders have also adopted a set of guidelines spelling out their terms for a transition period and a rough timetable for next few months. And now we will have a look at the weather forecast. It will be cool with some clouds tonight across the kingdom with northwesterly moderate winds. For tomorrow, a slight rise in temperature is expected with pleasant conditions across the country with southeasterly moderate to brisk winds. Daytime temperature expected in Amman for tomorrow will reach a high of 16 Celsius and a low of 6 degrees at night. The Gulf of Aqaba will register a high of 23 degrees Celsius and a low of 13 at night. To end this news bulletin, here are the main points once again. Jordanian protesters take to the streets after Friday prayers against the U.S.'s decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Three Palestinians are killed in today's clashes with Israeli forces. And finally, the Yemeni army makes advances against possessions of Houthi rebels in Shabwa province. And with this, ladies and gentlemen, we reach the end of a news bulletin. The time here at Radio Jordan is 7 minutes past 7. Thank you for listening and have a good evening.
Radio Jordan 96.3 FM.